Good afternoon, everyone. You're very, very welcome to this afternoon's session at the Dublin Festival of History. Big weekend. My name is Cormac Kinsella and I'm one of the programmers for the festival. And I'm delighted that we're here today for this session we've called Heroines of the Wars, because we have heroines from both the Great War and World War II. We have two historians, Clare Mulley, she's the author of The Spy Who Loved and The Women Who Flew for Hitler, and also, what she's going to talk about today, her new book is Agent Zoe, which is the untold story of the fearless World War II resistant fighter Elzbieta Zawacka. She'll be joined by Rick Stroud, who's the author of Kidnap in Crete, which is the true story of the abduction of a Nazi general and also of the Phantom Army of Alamein. And they're moderating this afternoon's session is Robert Gervart, who is a great friend of the festival. This is his 12th Dublin Festival of History that he's appeared at. And he's been here since the very start, and we kind of couldn't have one without him now at this stage. And very appropriately for these two books, he is the director of the UCD Centre for War Studies. And I just want to repeat, as we always have to do, that the Dublin City Council very generously fund and sponsor this festival, and it's produced by Dublin City Libraries and the Dublin City Council Culture Company. So could you please welcome to the stage Clare Mulley, Rick Stroud and Robert Gervart.
Thank you so much, Cormac, for this very kind introduction. It's really my great pleasure and privilege to present to you these two extraordinary books about extraordinary women's lives. And they cover both world wars. Here they are, but obviously you've got the covers up there as well. And it's going to be a great pleasure to talk about these books written by Clare and by Rick. And I think it would be sensible if both of you very briefly introduced your books so that those who haven't had the pleasure of reading them thus far get a sense of what we will be talking about in a minute. So I think we'll start chronologically with Rick's book, which is focused on the First World War, and then we'll move to Clare, whose book obviously covers the second. So Rick, please.
Yes, my book is about Belgian women agents in World War I. You've probably heard of Edith Cavell, if you've heard of any of them, but I'd be very, very surprised if you've heard of Gabrielle Petit, who was one of our most important agents. She was only 23 when she was captured and executed, and even Edith Cavell has sort of gone into the mists of history. People don't really know who she is. There's a marvellous statue of her in London. When I say Edith Cavell or Gabrielle or any of the others, their faces cloud over as they try to think. What I would like to do, just to get going, is to read you the introduction to my book, which is about the execution of Gabrielle Petit, because it sort of sets the tone for what happened. So, if you'll bear with me, I'll just read that, and then I'll hand over to Clare. On the evening of the 31st of March 1916, a 23-year-old woman stood in her cell in the prison of Saint-Lazare in occupied Brussels as a German military translator read an official letter from Berlin. Next to him stood the officer who had brought the letter to the prison. It informed her that the application to commute her death sentence had been refused and that she was to be executed at dawn the following morning. The translator stood in silence while the young woman absorbed the news. Then the officer told her to make arrangements for the disposal of her possessions and money. She was then allowed out of her cell to take her final exercise in a small caged outdoor area. As she passed through the door, she wrote on the jamb, "They consent to shoot me tomorrow. Farewell to all my unknown and much tried friends." At 5 the next morning, the 1st of April, the prison chaplain came to hear her confession. As she was led from her cell, Belgian warders lined the corridor, a sign of respect in defiance of the German occupying forces. One of the guards reported that the young woman walked through the dark prison corridors like a soldier. Wearing a long blue coat, she stepped into the pre-dawn gloom of the outside world, where a motorized carriage awaited her. Next to it stood the prison chaplain with a rosary and a prayer book. As they set off, he asked whether, when the time came, she would like a blindfold. She said, "I'm not afraid of looking into the rifles. I've been expecting this for a long time." Dawn broke as the car was driven through the sleeping suburbs of the city. The young woman began to recite the rosary. "Hail Mary, full of grace, pray for us sinners." After 20 minutes, they reached the entrance to the execution ground, a grim building with a massive stone tower looming over its center. 4 soldiers swung open a red and white security barrier. The woman finished her rosary. "Pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death." Then she kissed the crucifix hanging from the beads. The carriage drove into the grounds and the road became a bumpy, unmade track. After a few hundred yards, it stopped. The door was opened and the woman stepped out. Waiting for her were 250 armed and uniformed men. Next to them was a bank of earth in front of which a heavy post had been hammered in. In front of the stake stood 12 men, their rifles ready, their faces anonymous under their helmets. Their commander was a young officer. A bugle sounded. The woman stood still. A voice boomed, "By the order of the Third Ward Council." The assembled party listened as the woman's crimes were listed. Finally, the sentence: "Has been condemned to death for espionage." She handed her rosary and her prayer book to the chaplain, her coat bright against the morning gloom. The officer drew his saber and commanded the soldiers to fix bayonets. The woman was led to the execution stake. A soldier tied her hands, then passed a rope round her waist, fastening it behind the post. As he tried to blindfold her, she twisted her head away. The clergyman whispered to her, "Let nothing disturb your thoughts of heaven." She paused and nodded and allowed her eyes to be bandaged. "Firing party present," ordered the young officer in command. The men brought their rifles to their shoulders. The officer raised his saber. "Firing party load." Each man chambered the one round that was in his magazine. The metallic clinking of the bolt sliding backwards and forwards echoed round the yard. The woman stood alone, her back straight. "Firing party, aim." Each member of the squad squinted down the barrel of his rifle, breathed in, bringing the sights up to the woman's heart, then held his breath and his aim. His right index finger tensed on the trigger. With one move, the officer swung the saber tip in an arc to the ground. Fire. The shots echoed. The young woman died instantly, shattered by bullets, her upper body slumping forward, held back by the rope, her head dangling lifelessly. Smoke from the rifles drifted across the scene. A doctor stepped forwards towards what was now a mass of crumpled blue. He examined the corpse and declared that the prisoner's execution had been determined by a bullet to the heart. One of the Allies' most important spies was dead.
Thank you very much, Rick, for reading this. Very moving opening section of your book, which both introduces one of your central characters, but also, I think, raises very interesting questions about techniques of writing, in your case, a group biography by starting at the end, which is interestingly also something that I did with my Heydrich book. I began with his death. And I would like to, before we move closer into the content of the book, would like to give Claire the opportunity to introduce her subject, Elzbieta, and to tell us a little bit more about what your book has found as a subject, but also how you told the story.
Thank you. I'd be quite happy not to talk and just let Rick read the rest of his book right now. Thank you. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you. I'm not going to read my book, but I'm just going to mention, not because it's not worth reading. It is. It's really. But I'm just going to talk a bit about who Elzbieta was to introduce her, Agent Zoe. So she was the only person to parachute from Britain to Nazi German-occupied Poland during the Second World War while wearing a dress, because she was the only woman to parachute that way. And it sounds fun, and she did pick a rather nice blue silk dress, but actually it was very important she was in the dress, because as soon as she got there, as soon as possible, she had to disappear into civilian society to keep working in the resistance. Having said she was wearing a dress, she was, of course, wearing a cardigan and a big overcoat on top of that. And on top of that, she was wearing her parachute drop suit, which was, it had a belt full of gold coins, it had pockets, she had a spade and a torch, she had 2 revolvers, of which she was very proud, and a cyanide tablet as well, just in case, which I'm glad to say she never used. And Zoe was terrified of heights, so she didn't like to jump from a parachute, but she wasn't particularly fazed, extraordinarily, about going into enemy-occupied territory, because she had already spent, I'm going to take my earring out because they were right, it's hitting on the mic. Thank you. She wasn't particularly fazed because she'd already spent most of the war in Nazi-occupied Poland. She was actually one of the very first women to serve in the Second World War. She was shaken awake by the force of an explosion in the early hours, 5 o'clock in the morning on the 1st of September 1939, and thought perhaps at first that it was the Polish airbase nearby doing manoeuvres, but put on the radio, got up immediately, put on the radio, and discovered that it was the Nazi German invasion, the Blitzkrieg, the start of the Second World War, and she immediately went into action. She was already in uniform. Posted to Lviv, did amazing work there, but it's the work that made her, Lviv, I should say now, in the Ukraine, the work that made her legendary was the work she undertook over the rest of the war, the entire period in the resistance, in her civilian clothes. She set up a women's intelligence network. It is significant, they were all women, but I think we'll probably talk about gender in a little bit together. After the war, in May 45, Churchill actually commissioned a report to discover where most of Britain's wartime intelligence had come from, and he found that from within Europe, almost 50% of it had come from one country alone, Poland. So very significant, and much of that would have been gathered by her network and her, Zoe herself smuggling it in the shaft of a key or the back of a brush across borders during the war. And then she was almost picked up. I mean, she evaded Gestapo multiple times, hair's breadth from being caught multiple times, and perhaps we can talk a bit about that as well, the dangers these women faced. But was then, when she was burnt on those routes she'd been working on, was commissioned as the only woman to serve as an emissary of an Allied army, the Polish Home Army, the Resistance Home Army, and sent across almost 1,000 miles of Nazi-occupied territory to Britain. The most extraordinary journey. It involved being shot at in the high freezing mountain passes of the Pyrenees, being thrown out of a hotel window, nearly drowned hiding in the water tender of a steam train. An extraordinary journey, but she eventually did make it, the only one of the 4 couriers sent out at that time to get to Britain with her microfilm intact. And this film was hugely important. But she also had a couple of missions to undertake there, one of which was to secure the legal military status of women in the Home Army, because women were considered volunteers, which was hugely important. It was a security risk. It was meant women couldn't go to the military briefings, but it also meant that they didn't have any protections under the Geneva Convention, unlike the male soldiers. And because of her action, many thousands of lives were saved, ultimately. And then she became the only woman, she's the only in so many times, the only woman to join the Polish elite special force, the Cichociemni, which means the silent unseen. But of course, as she's a woman, she's the only Cichociemna. And then the only woman to parachute back to Nazi-occupied Poland, where she took part, played a significant role in the largest organised act of resistance and defiance against Nazi German occupation in Europe, which was the Warsaw Uprising, which I just mentioned was happening 80 years ago on this very day. And amazingly survived the war and kept fighting, because Poland was left with a Soviet-backed communist regime, and she kept fighting. So that's a bit of an introduction to her.
Yeah, it's an absolutely extraordinary life, and both books have in common not only that they are dealing with extraordinary women, but also that they are exceptionally well written. Claire mentioned one of the key themes, I guess, that bind your books together, which is, of course, gendered experiences of the Second World War, particularly the experience of women who actively participate in the fighting over the last 20 years. Historians have become much more interested in the experiences of home fronts, where, of course, women played a very significant role, but we know a lot less about women who took up weapons. We know a little bit about partisans, particularly female partisans, particularly in the Balkans. But I think one of the exceptional contributions that your books make to the existing literature is to really center female experiences. So what I'm interested in is that, I know, Claire, you've written about women at war before, but in this particular case, how did you find your subjects, or how did your subjects find you?
I had written a book about the women of the SOE, which is the Special Operations Executive in World War II, who were they were in F section, which was the one dealing with France, and they'd been parachuted into France. And I was interviewed by an American in Berlin about this book, and I became friendly with her, and she sent me, it shows how random these things, but sort of a year after it had been published, she sent me a cutting from the New York Times or from an American newspaper, and in the cutting was about women who had been brave in the war, but it also included women who had been in the First World War, about whom I knew at that time very little. And one of them was a woman called Marie de Croix, who was a princess. And I thought, well, that's sort of up my street. I'm very interested in writing about what happens to women in extraordinary circumstances. So I began to investigate Marie de Croix, and just as taking up on your point about gender, Marie de Croix was a woman, she was an aristocrat, and she helped repatriate soldiers who'd been marooned behind the lines after the German invasion of Belgium. And in her chateau, she had a secret room, and soldiers used to hide in the secret room when the Germans came to see if they could find anything. And one day, the Germans came, they found nothing, the men were let out, and the princess said to her, "Look, I've just saved your lives, and yet you won't give us the vote." That's really clever, isn't it? So, I mean, it was, she was a sort of archetype of woman owned by men. Anyway, that got me going on. I found out more and more about these women, and I thought, well, there were, in the end, thousands of them, but I decided to write about 5 or 6 or 7, I think it turned out to be 8 women, as the lens through which to examine the whole experience.
Claire, what about you?
Well, there is this, even though I've done 5 books, and you've done quite a few in this area as well, there is still a rich seam of untold women's history, and I think often, even when it is being told, it tends to be told in quite romantic terms. You know, women in the resistance, and female special agents in particular, we tend to remember their courage correctly, and their sacrifice, which we rightly do need to honour, but we're told about their beauty, and that often could be a problem for these women if they were beautiful, because it made their faces more memorable. Or we're told, a lot of them weren't beautiful anyhow. It's not actually necessary, and it can be unhelpful. But we're much less good at remembering their achievements and how effective they were in the role. And I had written a previous book, one of my books called The Spy Who Loved, about the first woman to serve as a special agent in the Second World War, which is how I met you, Rick.
Yes, indeed.
And it's an extraordinary story, and it was a privilege to tell that history. And without blowing my own trumpet too much, but I was very honoured, because afterwards the Republic of Poland gave me an honour for the contribution I'd made to the history, which I never know when to wear in bed, obviously, every night. I'm very proud of it. But and so I went to the event at the Polish Embassy, and there were 5 people being given an award, cultural award. There were 3 strapping lads, there was me, and there was a fairly elderly lady, very short, called Hanna Czarnocka. And I thought, she looks interesting, go and have a chat with her. And I asked her why she was getting an award, and she had been a participant in the Warsaw Uprising when she was a 16-year-old girl. She hadn't been allowed to bear arms, she hadn't been in the front line, but actually the whole of Warsaw was in the front line almost immediately. And she had been sent out to get medical supplies across the city, and she'd managed to find 10 glass bottles of methylated spirits which could be used. And she put them in this homemade rucksack and was running back when she got caught in an incendiary bombing raid, so a fire bombing raid. and she felt some shrapnel smash into her back. Luckily, she was protected by these bottles, but one of them smashed, and she told me she had this odd sensation in the burning street of feeling this cold liquid soak into her shirt. And she said, Claire, at that point, I knew I wasn't going to make it because I was a petrol bomb. But she did. She made it back, and she delivered the other 9 bottles, and all they said to her was, you smashed one. And so I was like, wow, amazing. So I have woven her story. This book it's a biography of Zoe, really, but it's about a group of women who all played different roles, who came together and knew her. And then she said, what are you doing? And I felt very humbled. I said, well, I'm just a reporter, basically. I've written a book on another extraordinary woman, Christina Scarbeck. She said, oh, Scarbeck, yes, she was great, but why on earth didn't you write about Zoe? She's the real heroine. And I was like, who's Zoe? So that's how I came across her.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. I have a question for you. I think most biographers know that feeling, that there is always a bit of a danger if you write about sort of heroic characters that you become too close to them. And I was just wondering, I'm curious whether there were moments when you had that feeling, or whether you, in your research, you identified anything in your characters that you didn't like.
That's a really interesting question. I don't think I became too close. I did become beguiled by Gabrielle Petit because she was a wild rebel. She came from a bourgeois family, but they'd rejected her, and she'd grown up in poverty. She wanted, above all, to be educated, and she pleaded with her rich uncle to fund her education, and he wouldn't. And she was always fighting her corner. She hated the orphanage where she was brought up, and she went and she left and got jobs in shops. She at one point was accused of being a prostitute, and she was very, very, very sort of denigrated by the people who knew her, but she fought through. And when British intelligence got hold of her, they got her to London to train her, and she said, at last I'm being educated. And all her wildness was channeled into the world of gathering information in very, very dangerous circumstances. So, in spite of what you've said, Claire, she had a glamour about her, which I couldn't help but cheer her on as she went, right up to the front line, which is about the most dangerous place you could be. Mm-hmm. I didn't get. I felt very, very. I mean, when I stopped writing, I did sort of feel really sad that these women had played a big part in my life. But I don't think I got overly fond of them. But I did admire all of them, and some were amazing, and some were not amazing. But they, gathering intelligence is a really boring thing. It's not saying there are 1 million Germans in the street outside. It's saying, oh, there's a lorry that went past with the sign on it that might be to do with something or other, and bigger authorities gather all this information, but it's tedium beyond tedium. A lot of the work was done by observing trains going by. They used to keep 24-hour watches on these trains, and they said it's really boring. But at the back of it, if you're caught, you could be you could be killed. So it's not swashbuckling bravery, but it is bravery of a very particular sort, if that answers.
We'll come back to that point, actually, about the dangers. Claire, how about you?
I like Gabrielle Petit as well. I read about her previously. I think she had a sense of humour as well, didn't she?
She did, yes.
One of her code names, because she's called Gabrielle Petit, and one of her code names was something like Grand or something. It was a name that reversed her name to give her.
Yes, and to interrupt that, sorry. When she was being marched around by the German guards with fixed bayonets and all that, she called them her guard of honour.
Exactly.
She just turned everything to her.
She had a great character. Zoe, I think you are absolutely right. You have to really get under the skin of your subject, but you always have to be careful, be aware of that you're not getting too close, and that you have a sense of perspective about them as well. With Zoe, she is fantastic and extraordinary. Her courage is remarkable, but she was quite a difficult character, and I actually like that in anyone that I meet usually. And she, for example, she had this sort of sense that her life was very fulfilled by her service, and she felt that she was giving other women the opportunity to also have that sense of making a real difference to their country. I mean, she was a real patriot. She said she sucked in patriotism with her mother's milk, and she did have an extraordinary childhood. So she had this feeling of liberating with the team. But what's wonderful in the archive is you find a lot of these women left, comments about her as well. And they said they were actually terrified of her. They said, oh, well, she called me a friend, but really I was just too scared to say no to her request. And even towards the end of her life, I interviewed people who had known her, and including a woman who'd shared a cell with her, actually. And they say they would warn each other, oh, she's got her general's boots on, so be a little bit careful around her today. So she was, there's lots of words that are only used for women, like difficult or prickly, and it's not that. But she was a very, if she was a man, in fact, during the war, when she's in Britain, they judge her very much for her gender. And I found in the British National Archives, as well as in the Polish archives in London, as well as the Polish ones, but in Britain specifically, the men that met her, they didn't know whether to salute her or to bow and kiss her hand. And they called her a captain in a skirt. And there's memos referring to her as a militant female dictator. And one of their objections to her is she has this sense of ambition. And later I found that ambition is one of the core qualities they were looking for in men to join the special forces. But in a woman, of course, that becomes a point of criticism. So it is because she is a woman that this becomes relevant and people find it difficult. But actually, that's partly what made her so successful in her role. So it's not a question of falling in love with them or whatever, but it's recognizing their strengths as you would judge anyone.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. Well, I would like to touch on that point that was raised by both of you earlier on about the extraordinary dangers that the women that you've written about operated under. Perhaps you could give the audience a sense. Obviously there's a difference between Belgium in the First World War and Poland in the Second, but nonetheless, obviously, being a spy always carries the risk of being executed, caught and executed as well, because in most countries in the world that would be punishable by death.
Yes, and I think this applies to agents, local agents in both the First and the Second World Wars. They were all amateurs. They were school teachers, they were princesses, they were housewives. They had no training. The Germans suddenly invaded, and suddenly they found themselves in a completely different world, and they're making it up as they go along. The German army had the field police in Germany that operated inside the occupied countries were very, very clever at identifying agents and following them and identifying whole groups. And if you're an amateur, you don't know what you're doing. And if they're out to get you, it only takes a tiny little, almost half a syllable wrong, or you say something wrong, or you're sitting in a funny place where you're not meant to be, and there's a field policeman, there's a secret policeman watching you, and then he'll follow you, don't know you're following him, and he will then try and work out if you really are an agent, and if you are an agent, where you will lead him. And it was always pretty well him, these policemen. And it took them a long time to work out ways. It took them until the middle of the First World War to work out a way to not have their networks broken. And if they had been caught, as Robert's just said, it was a question of, life imprisonment or execution. And when I was writing the book, I tried to imagine what it's like to be an agent. So I'm going to meet Agent X, and I don't know all the people in the street. I don't know who they are. So I exist in a state of permanent high tension with a stomachache, because if I drop my guard for a second, that could be it for me.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Claire, can you take us to Poland in the 1940s?
Yeah, I can add a bit that's relevant, I think, probably to both our books as well, which is, women's gender is significant for them in this particular role as secret agents, as special agents, or resistance more widely, because women, of course, had this superpower, particularly in the 1940s, arguably still today, which is that men were, especially of conscription age, are always going to draw attention. They should either be in prison already, or caught in a prison of war camp, in the army, in active service. If you get someone moving around, they're going to attract attention. Whereas women can move around everywhere. They are looking after their families. They're trying to keep businesses going. They're going to the market and all that. And so there are lots of women cycling around, moving around, flagging lifts. And they are, this is women's superpower, isn't it? That we are overlooked. and we're underestimated, okay? That's what made them their gender so significant. That's why they were so good in the role, which suggests that maybe they're never going to be picked up. But of course, the Germans, they certainly didn't expect early on that their grandmother sitting on the tram or the laughing girls serving them a beer had got an ulterior motive. But when they cottoned on, the response was invariably incredibly brutal. And these women, of course, paid the ultimate price, and normally they were tortured very brutally before. And a number of friends, Zoe's entire family were arrested by the Germans during the war at different points. Her sister was sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. I have to say, she did survive, and there's a lovely photograph of her getting married later on, so it's happy. Her brother was taken, he was put in Auschwitz, and he was beaten to death. Her cousin was sent to Auschwitz, and he's one of the few who managed to escape and get out. But a lot of the women were executed, but women were also arbitrarily rounded up on the streets to be hostages. I think the resistance in Poland is different. It's different to the First World War. It's different even to resistance in other nations in the Second World War. So in Poland, the Germans had this view that the Poles was subhuman. I mean, I hate to use that terminology, it's just appalling. And so the brutality there was particularly harsh. So Hans Frank was based in Warsaw. He was the Governor General of Poland for the Nazis, and he would say, there aren't enough trees in the whole of Poland for me to cut down and make the paper to list the names of those I'm going to execute. So they would execute not 1 or 10 people in retribution for a German death, but 100. So yes, Zoe was very aware of what the stakes were, and there are so many times where she just smudges her fingerprint so that it won't be seen on fake papers, and that will save her life. Or there's one occasion where she's been followed for about 24 hours and she's absolutely exhausted. She finally gets on a train to go back to Warsaw, and she's managed to hide her film and this suitcase full of dollars that she's been taking to the resistance, but she's still being followed. And she's on this late train, and eventually the guy sitting opposite her staring at her, and she realizes she gets to Warsaw. They're probably just waiting to see who's she going to meet so they can arrest more people, but they're going to pick her up. So she takes off her jacket and leaves it on her chair and walks down the corridor towards the toilets, thinking, what am I going to do? And she sees out the window, she sees telegraph poles whizzing past, the train's not slowing down. And then she just thinks, I've got to do it, even though she's terrified of heights, as I mentioned. So at one point, she just passes the passenger door and she pulls it open and throws herself from the train. And one of the things I love about her is she's got a sense of humour even there. Later she said, at moments of mortal danger like this, my thoughts turned to cowboy and Indian literature, of which I loved to read when I was young. And I thought how these guys, they try to jump up in the air to slow down their momentum. So that's what she tried to do. But of course, she just landed, she came down hard and very fast and smacked herself up quite badly, but didn't hit a telegraph pole, didn't end up under the wheels of the train, and wasn't shot by the Gestapo and can continue her service. So, I mean, yeah, extraordinary feats.
I mean, just on the point about invisibility, and this is not as daring do or as glamorous as that, but there was an old woman whose apartment overlooked a major railway junction, and she would sit, very old, sweet old lady, knitting away, and the Germans could see her knitting away. What they didn't realize is that she was knitting information about every train that passed into her knitting, and she could then pass that on to the Allies. And you know, that's a nice old lady. What possible harm could she do?
Exactly. Zoe's network, they had women whose buildings overlooked the train tracks and thoroughfares, but also, you know, secretaries, translators, cleaners, office cleaners, but just women who worked in bakeries and laundrettes who could note changing garrison orders or the numbers and types of uniforms passing through to different laundrettes, and they could follow it that way. So all of this
incredibly important. That sort of little details of information
pulled together into statistics.
We're talking about the dangers. There's, of course, also, we don't, unless you want to talk about it, don't necessarily need to speak about it now. We can take it up in Q&A, because there's still a couple of other things I wanted to talk about. But there's also, of course, the additional risk of being subjected to sexualized violence. Of course, rape is a major theme, particularly in the Second World War, but also to a certain extent in the First. And we know about research about, for example, female Red Army soldiers indicated very clearly that when captured, they were subjected to particularly brutal treatment.
There is I wrote this book called Lonely Courage. It has a woman called Noor Khan, who was an Indian agent, and she was very gentle, and she was condemned to death, and the officer who was in charge of her was told the night before he killed her, give the Creole the works. And he said, and he was debriefed after the war, he said, by the time I had finished with her, she was a bloody mess, and it included, we think, rape. But her spirit was so strong that as he fired, or as he was about to fire the shot into the back of her head, she turned and looked at him and said, liberté. And that word, which she can't have thought would get outside the walls of the prison that she was in, has resounded down the decades. And I went to the inaugural Noor-Khan Liberté lecture at London University about 5 years ago, given by an Indian woman who's a civil rights lawyer. So, I mean, that's not quite your point, but women were, the fear of rape, and you'll have much more about this, you know.
I mean, I think it's really right to mention it, and I'm glad you do, because it's often not on the agenda, and it's an untold story in all sorts of parts of this war, including even in the Holocaust as well, and it's often not considered because of the other appalling crimes. So I'm really glad you raised it. But I don't want to add further anecdotes.
No, sure. No, of course. No. I just wanted to mention it because I think it is important to be conscious of it. But before we open up to the audience, I would like to take the audience into the workshop. I like to do that of the author, and find out a little bit more about how you went about your research. How did you put together the pieces that eventually became the book?
Well, lots of the women that I wrote about have written themselves about their experiences, and so I read all that they'd written. Went to the National Archives. I went to the normal places, and what I try to do is to everything I write is as true as I can possibly make it, and it obviously is not 100% true because that's impossible, but it's as true as I can make it, and I then try to write it. It's all true, but I try to write it as though it were a novel. And again, the most graphic example of that is that an agent in the Second World War is parachuted into France, and I said she had a poem in her mind. So you could say, well, how the hell do you know she had a poem in her mind? Well, she did have this poem in her mind because it was part of her cryptographical equipment. She'd had to learn it, and it's actually a very well-known poem. So I tried to get inside the heads. I'm a film director as well, and so it's part of my role to sort of channel a character, and I tried to get inside them and then talk with their voice, and the princess and Gabrielle. This is sort of vainglorious boasting, but I could use my film director skills to become Gabrielle, or get as near as a bloke as I can do, and all the others.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your journey from the reception in the Polish embassy to the finished product?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say I think I'm not a film director, but I think you can. I think we both try to write compelling page-turning histories.
Yes,
I mean, I certainly don't use any dialogue that I haven't found in a letter or in a diary or anything. So yeah, my journey, well, I mean, the first thing, you do your background research, but I very soon realised I was going to have to spend a lot of time in Poland. This is the second book on a Polish subject I've done, so I do know some people in the archives and so on. So I went out, the Polish embassy very kindly supplied a translator for the 2 weeks I was out there, who I then kept on. And we did a bit of a tour. It was absolutely incredible. At one point, we started out at the place, the field where she parachuted in, and wonderful to find that there was a memorial there, and we put a wreath down for those who did not survive. And then we were driving to Warsaw, and we passed a convent, and I said, well, let's stop there, because I know twice, we haven't got time to tell all the stories of why she was there, but twice she had to hide in this convent, Szymanów convent. And we were looking through the gates, and a nun walked past with a flask of tea. It was quite cold. And she said, I'm so sorry, this is private property, would you move on? And my translator said, oh, I'm sorry, this is Clare Mulley, she's a historian, she's interested. Oh, she said, oh no, Clare Mulley, I know her. And I just thought, I'm pretty sure I've not been to this convent before, I don't know this lady. And she said, oh, she wrote this book on Christina Skarbek, who went to school here, and we love it. If it's, come on in. So they invited me in, and she introduced me to the oldest nun there, Sister Janina, who serves as the archivist, who worked alongside the nuns who had sheltered Zoe, and gave me the story. It's one of those hair-tingling. Yes. But also I interviewed a guy, Andrzej Jarzymski, who was the press secretary for Lech Wałęsa before and during and after the Solidarity movement. And he's a bit like Alistair Campbell, I suppose, over here. And he gave me quite a good amount of time, and halfway through he said, would you like to hear her voice? And he had recorded her in the 80s, and he got out a tape deck and put this tape in, and I could hear her pounding on the table and her voice getting all emotional and teary at times and laughing at times. And then the tape ended and there was a clunk, and then this martial music blared out. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't realise you were a marching band kind of guy. Could I just ask what this music is? And he said, oh, when I was recording, it was in the communist days, and we weren't allowed to have blank tapes. It was illegal. It was considered seditious to do this kind of work. But I knew I had to record her story. So he found the best tapes to record on, put a bit of sellotape on, and record on top of, were the state tapes. So he had literally recorded the testimony of this resistance fighter over the propaganda of the regime. It was just perfect. And then later, I even interviewed Lech Wałęsa, who gave her, because she served in the Solidarity movement. She was such an extraordinary fighter, and she was responsible for ultimately helping to bring democratic freedom to her nation. And Lech Wałęsa said how much they were inspired by these Second World War heroes. And he'd given her Poland's highest award, the Order of the White Eagle, and he said that she didn't seem that impressed. And then he realised what she really wanted, because she had secured legal military status for women as soldiers, not just as volunteer fighters. He promoted her, and so when she died, she's only the second woman in Polish history to be a general, brigadier general retired.
Brilliant.
That's what she wanted.
What you've just touched on is the serendipitous nature of research. You get these marvellous accidents, like you're finding this nun. I mean,
it's half just being really dogmatic and going everywhere,
yes.
and
but
half
it's also
the luck when you get there as well. Yeah.
Very important.
Thank you so much for talking a little bit about your research journey. You certainly both have succeeded in writing extremely compelling histories of these heroic women, and I encourage everyone to pick up a copy as you go out and find out more about these characters. At this point, I would like to open the floor for maybe 10 minutes to...